We're back to the subject of proselytism. We have two final divisions here in our study, and we're looking at diaspora Jewry as a seed sown, the one great positive effect that the dispersion had with regard to the world. We're going to look at proselytism, and then tied right into that, we're going to look at how proselytism is discussed and how it relates to the New Testament church. And so last week we had looked at the Hebrew background, ger, G-E-R, for proselyte. Tonight's going to be rather technical, and then once we get through with this, then I hope we can maybe move along more quickly looking at a lot of the other interesting facets of this. But we'll have to deal with a lot of statistics. You're accustomed to this before. Whenever we come across a term that becomes rather significant in our study, then we try to do a study etymologically of the term, looking at it in the Hebrew, if it's a Greek term, looking at it in the LXX, in Jewish writings, in Christian writings, in the New Testament documents, and so forth, which is what we're going to do tonight. So, as far as etymology is concerned, or terms, last time we looked at the Hebrew, ger, and then tonight we're going to look just at the Greek, and we'll spend all of our 60 minutes tonight looking at the Greek term, which is proselutos. Which you can tell is the origin for our word proselyte, proselutos. So you've got mysterion, not that long ago in ITP, and you've got ger, the Hebrew. And what did ger mean? Sojourner, a stranger, a sojourner. And now for the Greek, we have proselutos, P-R-O-S long E-L-U-T-O-S, proselutos. So I'll probably keep using that word tonight instead of proselyte. That's our anglicized form, our modern English form of it, but I'll be using the Greek term proselutos. But since they're so similar, you'll obviously know what I have reference to. It comes from the verb proserkomai. Probably it comes from the verb proserkomai. Which is one of those oddities in Greek, not that there are only a few of them, but it just has funny forms because it's referred to as a deponent verb. Now, I don't know that this will do us a lot of good as English-speaking Christians to go too far in this business, but I just thought I would add this in for completeness' sake. Proselutos comes from the verb, a deponent verb, proserkomai, which can mean either I come or I go, just a simple verb for come or go. You can also drop this and just have erkomai. And you also have a verb that means I come, I go. You can have exerkomai, I go out, aserkomai, I come in, dierkomai, I go through. Add everything on to this little ending here, erkomai, we drop this off, the prefix to it, and we simply have our verb that means I come or I go. And as I say, you can change it all around to and have I go out. You can have aserkomai, I come in, dierkomai, I go through, and so forth. Now, by deponent, what I mean here is in Greek we have what we call three different voices: active, middle, and passive. We have the first and the last of those in English. We don't have middle. Active, what this basically means is that the subject is acting. Middle, the subject acts upon the subject. And passive, the subject is being acted upon. Just a real quick lesson in Greek here to show you what I mean by a deponent verb. With verbs such as proserkomai and all the other verbs fitting in one of these categories, sometimes being able to be switched between the categories, that's not always true, and generally, but this is not always true either, taking different endings depending on whether the verb is active, middle, or passive. So active, the subject is doing the acting. John kicked the ball. John is the subject, he is acting, he kicked the ball. Passive, John is being kicked by Frank. Well, that's passive, the subject is being acted upon by someone else. Middle, John kicked himself. He's the subject, and he's doing the acting, and the action is upon himself. So that's the three different voices there. Now, as I say, that they take three different endings. Deponent, and generally you'll just see it abbreviated in your grammars or your textbooks as just DEP period, which means deponent, means that, and it only concerns verbs now, voice concerns verbs and not nouns, means that the verbs such as I come, I go here as it is, proserchomai, or any of the other forms, erchomai, exerchomai, aserchomai, dierchomai, and so forth, will have middle passive endings, which is what this is. O-M-A-I. It'll have middle passive endings, but it'll have an active meaning. I mean, how can you have a verb like proserchomai, which means I go or I come, although it has middle passive endings? How can you have it with a middle ending? How can you say I go, I go, and somehow you cause yourself to be the one who goes and who does the going upon oneself? That'd be impossible. So it doesn't really fit under middle passive forms or under middle passive meanings, although it has a middle passive form by this ending. Now, it's an active verb with middle passive endings is what I'm saying. And we would think that if it's an active verb, it would have an active ending, which would be something like this. The omega, long O, which would be for an active verb. So enough on that. I'm sure I got you confused. But it's a deponent verb. To say it very succinctly, it's a deponent verb, which means it has middle passive endings, middle passive form, but an active meaning. Proserchomai. We could do something with this word. Once I get in my languages, I don't like to stop, do I? We can just change it slightly. You notice the slight change in the word? From this to this. From proserchomai to prosukomai. This letter right here, we went from an R to a U. And we have our chief New Testament verb for I pray. Prosukomai is pray. Now you have different verbs for pray in Greek and in the New Testament, but that's our chief verb for pray in the New Testament is prosukomai, not proserchomai, but prosukomai. Okay, back to proselutos, since that's really all we're concerned about. We see its origin here. It is dependent upon a deponent verb. Let's erase up to here. I got to at least pretend like I know what I'm talking about. I got to take every opportunity I can to show you that I'm some type of scholar. If proserchomai means I come, I go, then the word that derives itself from that, proselutos, means one who goes or comes. Or to say it another way, the word means a newcomer or a visitor. Proselutos means a newcomer or a visitor. Now, doesn't that sound very similar to the Hebrew's ger, which was a sojourner? That's kind of like a newcomer. He sojourns from one place and comes to another. So he's visiting there. He has newly come to this place. Proselutos does not appear outside of Jewish and Christian writings. In other words, it's not from classical Greek. It was not used by the Greek writers. It's used only by the religious writers from a Judeo or Judeo-Christian background. And it has been suggested, and it probably cannot be proven one way or the other, but it has been suggested appropriately enough that perhaps the term proselutos was actually coined by the diaspora synagogues for the Hebrew term ger. They simply didn't have something that they thought corresponded neatly enough to a term that they were very familiar with now, the ger and the gerim of Old Testament, of Pentateuchal theology, and so they coined a term. They invented a term that would appropriately match that. That's a good suggestion, because the term is not found anywhere else in Greek. It starts in Jewish writings. Non-Christian Jewish writings is where it begins. And then it works its way right over into Christian Jewish and Christian Gentile writings. And then it's worked its way right down to us today. And you could hardly stop someone out there in the world who wouldn't know what the term proselyte means. They know what a proselyte is. It's someone who converts, this is what they'd say, someone who converts from one religion to another religion. And they're somewhat right the way the term has come down to us today. Although as you're seeing from this, that's not its origin. Proselutos, a newcomer or a visitor. Now I want to divide our study up tonight into 5 different sections on the basis of sources. The LXX, Philo, Josephus, the New Testament, rabbinical writings. So let's start with the first and most important of those, which will be the lengthiest of those, and that is the LXX, the Septuagint. This is the first time the word appears in the history of language. Looking at the term proselutos, how is it used in the Septuagint? The Greek translation in Egypt of the Hebrew Old Testament. It's the first time it appears. And it generally, almost all the time, appears as a translation, or a Greek equivalent, a replacement, for the Hebrew ger, G-E-R, which, remember, just meant sojourner. Now, was the ger in Hebrew, was he a convert or was he not a convert? He could have been both. It would depend on the context there. The ger, he could just be a resident alien, that he came to live within Israel. He sojourned from his own land to Israel and chose to stay there for a shorter or longer period of time. He could convert to Israel's religion, which would make him a convert of what we would think of today as a proselyte. So he was a sojourner all the time. Whether he became a convert or not is another matter. He was always a sojourner. That's what the term ger means. Sometimes he came just to live temporarily in Israel and perhaps later leave. More times than not, if he came to Israel, he probably came to stay. And if he came to stay, he came to embrace the religion of the Jewish people as well. Thus, he became a convert. Proselutos, as it appears in the LXX almost 80 times, most of the time means convert. See, I can't say most of the time means proselyte, because that's the word proselyte, proselutos. So we'll have to use convert until we can work our way around this. It appears 80 times or so. Most of the time, it means convert. In other words, we're seeing, and we always see this, or let me take that back. Oftentimes we see this, that we'll see a concept in the LXX that's in process of evolution. It's in process of evolving from a Hebrew context and a conceptual framework in the Old Testament or in Jewish economy, and a full-blown view of this whenever we come over into Christianity, because the LXX, and it's a very important work, stands precisely in between the two. But what I'm saying here is that in the Old Testament, ger appears many times, and many times it appears simply as stranger. I mean, it just means a stranger, a sojourner, without really any thought to a religious context. Whether this man becomes a convert to whatever religion or people we're talking about, it simply means stranger. So, whenever we come to the LXX, we're finding an equivalent for ger in proselutos, but now the statistics are shifting in another direction. Now, whenever that term proselutos appears, most of the time, it's used in a religious sense as a convert. That's what they mean by it. Most of the time, they are taking it as a strictly religious term. When it appears in the New Testament, and it does 4 times, proselutos, it always has reference to one's religion. And to reverse ourselves in time, whenever the ger, with the word, appears in the Mishnah, since it was written in Hebrew, they would not use the Greek term proselutos, but whenever ger appears in the Mishnah, which was written around AD 200, then it always means convert. So if we were to, we would describe it or diagram it like this. Regardless of whether we're talking about ger or proselutos, it would be the first one, ger, for the first and last, Old Testament and the Mishnah, and proselutos for the LXX and the Septuagint. Here, sometimes, ger means convert. Here, most of the time, proselutos means convert. The New Testament, all the time, proselutos means a religious convert. In the Mishnah, around 200 AD, M-I-S-H-N-A-H, in the Mishnah, all the time, although we're to Hebrew now, ger means a religious convert. So here's how we're shifting in an evolutionary sense here, from sometimes to most of the time to by the time we get to AD years now, the 1st century and the beginning of the 3rd century AD, with the New Testament and the Mishnah respectively, all the time the appearance either of proselutos in the New Testament or ger in the Mishnah refers to a religious convert. So what we do then is go through this process of simply a sociological meaning. In the Old Testament, ger, just a sociological meaning, oftentimes one who travels from one society to another society. He's just a stranger, a sojourner, and an alien. Doesn't have any reference to his religion at all. We go from a sociological reference to a socio-religious reference, and we pick some of that up in the Old Testament by virtue of the fact that sometimes ger does refer not only to one who simply has sojourned from point A to point B, but then who later adopts the religion of the people at point B. So we've gone beyond just a sociological framework. Now we've gone to a religious one. As we work our way through the LXX, and we're more to the religious side than the sociological side. By the time we're to the New Testament and to the Mishnah, it's always to a religious side we're going. So we shift again, evolutionarily speaking, from a sociological to a socio-religious to a religious sense. And the term today, of course, as it comes down to us, proselyte, is a technical term. It has become a technical term that is always used in a religious context. We speak of making proselytes. And that dates back to, well, the LXX, when it first starts using that as a technical term, perhaps coined by the diaspora synagogues as a replacement, a Greek equivalent for the Hebrew ger. Are you with me thus far then? You see the evolution of the term. Today we don't use it. In other words, if someone, to give you an example, if someone from France moves to the United States, we don't call him a proselyte, do we? You know, he's moved over. According to the Old Testament, he's a proselyte. He's a stranger who has sojourned over, but we don't use that term that way anymore. Now it's always used in a religious sense. And people accuse you of trying to make proselytes to your church and your religion. Well, they don't mean that just someone's going to move here, but someone's going to adopt your religious beliefs, and they're going to express them in an equivalent fashion. Now, some scholars have argued, I know this is rather technical, so we're only going to spend one night on this, that proselutos did not have the religious meaning of convert until the 1st century AD. Let me say that again. Some people have argued that proselutos did not have the religious meaning of convert until the 1st century AD. Of course, I have just denied that with my little explanation here, but let's now prove that by looking at the LXX statistics. You're familiar with the way we do this, but we've done this many times. We'll give you various points and look at the statistics in the LXX. I don't think that's true. I think that, as I've already said, but I've got to be able to prove it with something that will back it up, that back with the LXX is where we find the first time, and that's several centuries prior to New Testament times, that the writers and the thinkers of the Jewish faith are already using the term proselutos in a religious context, meaning convert. And that's not something that is reserved, as far as its birth is concerned, for the first century. For Christianity or for rabbinical Jewish studies of the first century A.D. So let me give you some statistics. Number one, so we're under LXX, but I'll give you a few points here. Proselutos appears 77 times as a translation for ger. It appears 77 times as a translation for ger, and one time for a translation of the verb gur. We looked at this last time. Gur was a verb and ger was the noun. G-U-R. 77 times it appears. Now it could appear other times as a translation for other words besides the ger gur term. So we're only talking about ger and gur because those are important Hebrew terms. 77 times as a translation for ger, and one time in 2 Chronicles 15:9. 2 Chronicles 15:9 as a translation for the verb gur. Number two, from our studies last week, we saw that ger could mean either sojourner and or convert. That's basic. You already know that, but I'll just have to say that to say what I want to really say. Ger, we saw from our studies last week, could mean sojourner and or convert. It could mean sojourner and no more. If it means convert, it has to include sojourner as well, because he had to sojourn from his Gentile country to come and live among the Jewish people. When speaking of Gentiles in Israel, it oftentimes meant convert. Deuteronomy 14:21 is probably an exception to that, but when speaking of Gentiles in Israel, so you're away from dispersion, you're away from that framework of thought, you're back to the Pentateuchal Old Testament narrative. When speaking of Gentiles in Israel, then ger could mean, oftentimes meant, a convert. But ger could also be used with the first meaning only, sojourner, its original meaning, sojourner, and of all things not be applied to a Gentile who travels, but to a Jew who travels. Now the Jews thought that was an interesting situation, the rabbis, whenever they look back and study their Old Testament, because this term ger was just kind of, a Gentile term. It was a sojourner. Sometimes he sojourned to Israel and then left. Sometimes he sojourned to Israel and then converted to Israel's faith. But of course, of course, we could never use that as a term for a Jewish person, because the Jewish people had been given a promised land. And once they came and lived in their promised land, they weren't sojourners. They were residents, and they were native-born, home-born there. So it could never refer to a Jew. Well, there are a few exceptions to that. Of all things, this what the rabbis classified as strictly a Gentile term, in a few places actually does refer to the Jewish people. For instance, in Genesis 23, verse 4, guess what Abraham is called? A ger. He's called a sojourner. It doesn't have anything to do with being a religious convert, but simply that he was a sojourner. Now I think that's the passage. Let's see, 24, he'd be sending out looking for a wife for Isaac. So in 23, Sarah must die. And he's bargaining for a burying place from the sons of Heth, the children of Heth, of the Hittites there. And he tells them, I am a sojourner. I was a sojourner in this land. And he calls himself a ger. Then in Exodus, I have Genesis, but it couldn't be because it's a reference to Moses. It must be Exodus 18:3. Exodus in 18:3, Moses named one of his sons what? Gershom. What is Gershom? What did he say that meant? I've been a stranger in a strange land. And you may even find it earlier in chapter 2 as well. But you'll find it here in chapter 18 with the name Gershom. I should be looking some of these up, so make sure I don't misquote all of this. Her 2 sons, of which the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been an alien in a strange land. Alien is a sojourner. It's ger. Moses calls himself, he's the paradigmatic Jew, the great lawgiver, the Hebrew of Hebrews of the Old Testament, and he calls himself by this Gentile. What the rabbis thought, of course the Jews of this day didn't think that was a particularly Gentile term. It just simply meant sojourner. It starts taking on these ethnic and religious connotations later on. And does that appear in chapter 2? Yeah, chapter 2 and 22. She bare a son and called his name Gershom, for he said, I've been a stranger in a strange land. That's what I was quoting, chapter 2:22. I've been a stranger in a strange land. But it's the same as what you find a little differently now in Exodus 18:3. I've been an alien in a strange land. It's really the same. And then Israel in Exodus 22:21, the whole nation, Israel in Exodus 22:21. Is called the Gerim, the sojourners. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him. This would be a sojourner, a ger, who would come into the borders of Israel. For ye were Gerim in the land of Egypt. You yourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt. So that clarifies a little more the use of the term ger in the Old Testament. It's not strictly a Gentile term. Can either mean sojourner and or convert. Okay, a third point, bringing us up to the LXX. The LXX almost always uses proselutos as a translation for ger when ger meant convert. If it didn't mean convert, then sometimes they use a different word. In other words, it's in a process of evolution and nothing is absolutely rigid by the time of the LXX. They do make exceptions. The LXX, our third point, the Septuagint, almost always uses proselutos for ger whenever ger means convert, or whenever they think that it means convert. In other words, if ger simply means sojourner and not convert, it simply has a sociological meaning and not a religious one, then they felt free to choose another term than proselutos. But then we have several qualifications or explanations for this third point. So we'll give you 2 points under this third point. Each time that proselutos is used in the LXX, it does not necessarily mean convert. It's not rigid by this time. It's not fixed by this time. In the New Testament times it is. In other words, they're always going to use, or almost always use, proselutos for ger whenever ger means convert. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that the LXX seems to be, the translators seem to be wanting to make a linguistic distinction, a distinction by use of words between the sociological and the religious, between simply a sojourner and a sojourner who becomes a convert. They seem to be wanting to make a distinction between that, which the Old Testament generally doesn't do. It just uses the term ger. And the context will have to tell you, is this a sociological context or is it a religious one? The LXX is wanting to be a little more clear in their understanding of whether or not it's sociological or religious, and they attempt to perform this by using different terms. But back to this first point under number 3. I said that each time proselutos is used, it does not necessarily mean a convert. One exception here, and these are rare because most of the time it means convert for them. Almost always whenever they're translating ger. But one exception would be Deuteronomy 10:19. Now, of course, the only way you'd learn these things is you'd study the Septuagint, or you'd study Hatch and Redpath's concordance to the Septuagint, and you'd look up all these terms and find out how they are used in light of the Hebrew text. Deuteronomy 10:19. Love ye therefore the stranger. Love ye therefore the stranger. For ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Well, here in this first appearance of stranger, love ye therefore the stranger, we would not expect proselutos, because as we go on to read, because you were strangers in Egypt, well, we certainly wouldn't take that to mean that you Israelites were converts in Egypt or converts to the Egyptian form of religion. We would just think you were sojourners in the strict, basic first sense of the meaning of the term. And so we would expect that for the first term. Love ye therefore the stranger, not talking about a proselyte, a convert, but simply the sojourner.
For the continuation of this message, please.
You're not talking about a proselyte, a convert, but simply the sojourner. And yet they use the term that they really enjoy using for a convert, which is proselutos. You understand what I'm saying here? They make an exception here then in Deuteronomy 10:19. Then a second point under this third one. Not every time the Hebrew has ger, whether religious or sociological, does the LXX give proselutos. I'm not duplicating what I'm saying. I'm just clarifying things step by step. Not every time the Hebrew has ger, whether religious or sociological, or I should say whether sociological or religious, does the LXX give proselutos. In 14 cases of ger, the LXX gives other words. Now, in 77 times for ger, as our first points hold us, in 77 times for ger, then we have proselutos. But in 14 cases of ger, the LXX gives other words. The chief of those being paroikos. Paroikos, paroikos, which appears 11 times. That would be 3 other words we would have to come up with for the 14 total cases where the Hebrew has ger and the LXX chooses to use another word besides proselutos. The chief one that it uses is paroikos, 11 times. And paroikos means something that's very similar to proselutos, a sojourner, one who wanders, a visitor, a newcomer. So why use a different word? But somehow they're wanting to make this distinction. Which then brings me to my fourth point, which I would say as follows. In other words, the LXX tends, T-E-N-D-S, underline, it tends. This isn't always true. This is not across the board, universally true. The LXX tends to make a distinction between sojourner and convert. It tends to make a distinction between sojourner and convert. In other words, it wants to clarify the religious use of ger by generally using the term proselutos and not paroikos. Let me say that again. The LXX tends to make a distinction between sojourner And it would do that by using the term paroikos, and convert, which they would translate as proselutos. For instance, here in Deuteronomy 10:19, love ye, but they're not always true to this rule. Love ye therefore the stranger, we would expect paroikos there, because it's not used in a religious sense. And for some strange reason, they give us proselutos. For ye were, and now we have paroikos, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. And yet we saw earlier in Exodus 22:21 that in a very similar passage that speaks of them being strangers in the land of Egypt, proselutos is used instead of paroikos. Now, I just said that this fourth point doesn't always hold. Sometimes it holds. I'll give you an example of that. Sometimes it doesn't. I've already given you an example of that, but I'll give it to you again. For instance, this passage we looked at last week, Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 21. You'll flip over here, and then I'll try to explain something that's doubly difficult when you tie this into Leviticus 17:15. Deuteronomy 14:21. See if you remember looking at this last time. We saw this in the last message. Here their distinction, and in other words, what I'm saying under this first point under number 4 is here their distinction will be upheld. A distinction between sojourner and convert, and they'll make that distinction between, with the use of the words paroikos and proselutos. Deuteronomy 14:21. Ye shall not eat of anything that dieth of itself. Thou shalt give it unto the stranger, the ger, the Hebrew would say, that is in thy gates, that he may eat it, or thou mayest sell it unto an alien, for thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God, and thou shalt not see the kid in his mother's milk. Now, if LXX wants to make a distinction between sojourner, the sociological sense, and convert, the religious sense, then which of the two terms would it choose to translate ger, or stranger, here in Deuteronomy 14:21? Paroikos. You'd want to choose that. It's exactly what they do. They choose that because probably we're not talking about a convert here, because Israel, if you're going to be a convert to Israel's religion, you have to adopt all of her religious beliefs. And here, Israel is disallowed eating meat that dies of itself. But Moses said you could give it to a stranger. So that couldn't mean you could give it to a stranger who's become a proselyte, because he is bound by the same laws that you are bound to as a Jew. However, if all of that is true, then how do we explain Leviticus 17:15? Leviticus 17:15. This is a chapter on eating meat and eating blood. How do we explain Leviticus 17:15? We just saw in Deuteronomy 14:21 that if an animal dies of itself, then you can't eat it, but you can give it to a stranger. You can give it to a ger. LXX said you can give it to paroikos. Then how do we explain this in light of that? Leviticus 17:15. Every soul that eateth that which dieth of itself, or that which was torn of beast, whether it be one of your own country or a stranger, he shall both wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the even, then shall he be clean. In other words, it seems like that man over in Deuteronomy 14:21, the stranger, if he ate the meat, since he's not under the religious laws of Israel, he doesn't become unclean. He doesn't have to go through any ritual of washing his clothes and bathing himself or anything like that. But now this stranger seems to be a different stranger than what we have over there. Well, in the Hebrew, you would know no difference, because ger, the same term, appears in both places. Here, the LXX is very helpful because it makes the distinction between these two strangers by using the two different terms. They understood the ger of Deuteronomy 14:21 to simply be a sociological stranger, a sojourner, a paroikos. They understood this one to be a convert to Israel's religion. Therefore, he was placed under the laws of the Jewish faith. And therefore, they use the term proselutos here in Leviticus 17:15. Now that's the best case I know of the LXX being able to help us with these terms by making a very clear distinction that the Hebrew doesn't make. And if we didn't have the LXX, of course, they're fallible men who gave us the translation. You know, maybe somehow these strangers, the one of Deuteronomy is the same as Leviticus, and the one of Leviticus is the same as Deuteronomy. You know, so how do we know? You can't base it just on the words selected by the translators of the LXX. Well, you have to study the passage and kind of think it out. How can this meat that this animal that dies of itself be allowed of one group of strangers and not another, unless we're talking about two different types of strangers? One which is simply ger, the sojourner, and one which is ger, sojourner, in its religious sense. He's a sojourner and he is a convert to the Jewish form of faith. So the LXX very wisely uses paroikos in Deuteronomy 14:21 and proselutos in Leviticus 17:15. So when it wants to make this distinction, this is what it tends to do, and it wants to do. Well, here it's successful between a sojourner and a convert. But sometimes their desire to make a distinction does not always hold true. An example would be Exodus 22:21. Exodus 22:21. In places where we would expect paroikoi, for the plural, sojourners, we instead find proselutoi. So they're not holding true to what they would like to do. Exodus 22:21. Last part of that, 22:21b. For ye were, we would expect, paroikoi. Ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. But instead we have proselutoi, which just really throws a kink into the whole system of their trying to make a distinction between the use of the words. Because Israel was not a convert down in Egypt. And I doubt that's what the LXX translators meant. Even if you think, well, they worship, foreign gods down there, so they converted to, well, really, that still, you wouldn't count that as a convert. They didn't convert to anything that was down there in Egypt. And I doubt that's what the translators had in mind. It's just that the terms were still rather fluid, becoming a little more concrete and regular, but somewhat fluid by the time of the LXX translation. So let me summarize in a paragraph everything that I've said about the LXX. Every preacher is supposed to say, now here's what I just said. So here's what I just said, without any of the statistics and numbers and verses. Proselutos is in process of evolution in the LXX, on its way from ger, as sojourner convert, to the New Testament rabbinical convert only. I'll say that again. Proselutos is in process of evolution in the LXX. The LXX is the bridge between two land masses, the strictly Old Testament land mass and the New Testament rabbinical landmass of the AD years. On its way from the ger, as sojourner and or convert, of the Old Testament, to the New Testament and rabbinical convert only. In other words, as I had these little four things up here, in the Old Testament, it sometimes could mean convert. In the LXX, it oftentimes means convert. In the New Testament and rabbinical studies, it always means convert. So the LXX is the bridge between these two land masses. Now, even its religious sense of convert still backtracks to draw on the original meaning, the basic meaning of ger, which is sojourner. But it's in a figurative, mystical type sense that you have sojourned from one religion to another religion. So be sure you understand that it never completely loses the idea of sojourner, but now it interprets sojourner in a religious sense, and not just in a political or sociological or geographical sense, that he has simply gone from one country to another. But in a spiritual sense, he's gone from one religion to another. as he has traveled from one country to another. Okay, that sums up the use of proselutos in LXX, which is where it's found for the first time. So let's come to our second source for an understanding of the term, and that would be the Jewish writer Philo, Philo. For Philo, who's writing 1st century AD, for Philo, proselutos, what do you think it means for Philo? Always it means a convert. See, as you get into these New Testament years, whether you're a Jewish writer or a Christian writer or a Jewish Christian writer, it's always going to mean convert. For Philo, proselutos always means convert and only convert. However, he doesn't use the term, but very infrequently. He prefers another term, epelus. He prefers this term, epelus, E-P-E-L-U-S, epelus, because of the fact that Philo is writing to a pagan audience. Many times he is, like Josephus, he's writing to Gentiles to prove the superiority of the Jewish faith. And so with that just said, why wouldn't he use proselutos? They wouldn't know the term. That term was coined by the Jewish people, evidently coined by the Jewish people for use in the Septuagint, the LXX. So although it's a very well-known term for the Jews, proselutos, how could you really use that if you're writing to a pagan Gentile audience who doesn't know that term? They've never heard that word before. So he has to use another term, E-P-E-L-U-S, epelus, which for him meant essentially the same thing as proselutos. Our third source would be Josephus. Just like Philo, he avoids the term as much as possible. I think that this is true with Josephus, that he avoids the term proselutos altogether. And he, of course, would do it for the same reason as Philo. He oftentimes is writing to a pagan audience as well. I believe Philo uses it, and it only means convert for him, and Josephus avoids the word altogether, writing somewhat later than Philo, but still in the 1st century. Okay, our fourth source, one more and we'll be through tonight, would be the New Testament. The New Testament uses the word 4 times. Let's run these references. We'll become very familiar with them because we'll study all of these verses in depth. You want to tell me where they are? You know where one of them is already. Matthew 23. Remember, you compass land and sea to make one, what? Proselutos. There's the first time it appears. Matthew 23:15. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye compass sea and land to make one proselyte. Proselutos is a Greek term, not a classical term, an LXX term. And what do you think proselyte means here? Sojourner? No, a religious convert. It means a convert, strictly a convert by this time. To make one proselyte. And when he is made, ye make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. Where are the other 3 times? Acts, always in Acts. Once in Matthew, 3 times in the book of Acts. Let's locate these. Only 4 times in the New Testament. Acts chapter 2 and verse 11. Acts 2 and verse, 10 rather. Acts 2 and verse 10. Listing some of these peoples, Phrygia, Pamphylia, and Egypt, parts of Libya, about Cyrene, and strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes. Jews and proselytes. Very difficult, perhaps very difficult passage to interpret because there's so much misunderstanding of these few verses here in Acts 2, but we will approach that matter later. I think difficult because some people came up with what their view is about why Luke gives us all these nations. Or what are these? Are these people who have come back to Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost? And they're from all these different nations, and some of them are Jewish people from all these different nations. And then Luke adds on there proselytes, which would be Gentile people from all these nations who have come to worship. Because of popular views of that, I think it becomes difficult to understand, because that's all we can think when we read it, what the popular view is. But I'm convinced the popular view is a false view. And then in Acts later, chapter 6 and verse 5. So the New Testament uses the term just like the LXX wants to use it. New Testament always uses it this way. Acts 6:5, the saying pleased the whole multitude. And they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Holy Spirit, and Philip, and Prochorus, and Nicanor, and Timon, and Parmenas, and Nicholas, a proselyte of Antioch. Now remember, whenever you see that term proselyte, we're not talking about a Jew then. A Jew couldn't be a proselyte to the Jewish religion. Proselyte would have to be a Gentile. So we know that this man, Nicholas, has to be a Gentile. He's used here very early in the Christian church, which was almost a strictly Jewish church, as you well know, at this early stage of its existence. Almost 100% Jewish. And yet one of its, perhaps this passage refers to deacons here, one of its deacons happens to have been a pure Gentile. I mean, pure Gentile. But one who converted to the Jewish faith, evidently, and now has converted from the Jewish faith to the Christian faith. So he's really had a life to live. Went from just pagan Gentile to Judaism, and now beyond that to its fulfillment in Christianity. And it's interesting that all of these men that are mentioned here, chosen as the deacons, all have Greek names. None of them have Hebrew names. Those are all Greek names there. Stephen, that's certainly not a... And Philip, those are certainly not Hebrew names. And Nicholas, that's not a Hebrew name. Those are all Greek names. That says something about these men that were chosen. And I think they were chosen because of their background for some other things that we'll discuss later. And then chapter 13 and verse 43. Paul preaching at Antioch, he's preached to the Jews, and they've enjoyed the message. And whenever they leave the synagogue, then the Gentiles meet Paul in verse 42, and they ask that on the next Sabbath day if he couldn't preach to them. Verse 43, now when the congregation, Acts 13:43, was broken up, many of the Jews and religious proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who speaking to them persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. Now, with all of this information that I've given you tonight, I mean, this is a classic verse in the New Testament with this business of proselytes and proselytism that gives the scholars all of the trouble. What do you think the trouble is with this verse here? Look at that verse again before you speak. It's in glaring red letters to you there, even if you have it written in black. Now, when the congregation was broken up, many of the Jews and religious proselytes followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, persuaded them to continue in the grace of God. In light of how the LXX uses it and how the New Testament uses it, what's the problem there? Why would you call him a religious proselyte, since proselyte only means a religious context in the New Testament? Why would you call him a religious proselyte unless, remember what I said here a few moments ago, that some scholars believe that proselutos doesn't take on this strictly religious sense until the first century. And somewhere during the first century it solidifies in its strictly religious meaning there. And so that would mean that here's our proof for that, Acts 13:43, that a proselyte could just mean a sojourner, not having any religious meaning to it at all. And so he has to clarify what type of ger, what type of proselutos we're talking about, by calling these people religious proselutoi, religious gerim. And they think they have a great proof text to disprove all of this business I've been laboring up here. But I think we can sneak in on the back door on those people, though. I think they've missed what is being said right here. But yes, see how those things will stand out to you now? Once I give you all this information, you'll ask yourself, why did he, it's like a double statement. Why do you say, that's like saying his name is John, John? Well, you said that the first time. If you called him a proselyte, you called him a religious man. So why do you call him a religious man? What do you call him? A religious there's no other type of proselyte in the New Testament but a religious one, not a sociological one, a religious one. So remember that, I'm sure you will, and we'll come back to that verse, and we'll try to understand that better later on. But my contention now, without proving it to you from that, is that the New Testament always uses the word in the religious sense of convert. But in New Testament times, perhaps in the New Testament, we will see about that later, there are various distinctions within the term proselutos. In other words, what I'm saying is that although the term always means a religious convert, a convert from religion A to religion B, there are different types of converts. There are different types of religious proselytes, if we want to say it as Luke says it here. There are different types of proselytes. Basically two, the proselyte of the camp of Israel and the proselyte of the gate. And that will take up a large section of our study later on as well. The different types of proselytes. The proselyte of the camp, or sometimes he's called the proselyte of righteousness, and the proselyte of the gate. Now those are probably, those are anachronistic descriptions of two different classes. By that I mean those terms do not appear in the New Testament, and they were used by the rabbis later, but they have reference to what we could colloquialize as the full and the partial or half proselyte. Still a religious convert, but the full convert and the partial convert. In other words, the Christian in any other church out there versus the Christian in this church. The full one versus the half one. And then finally for this evening, our final source would be rabbinical writings. Now the rabbinical writings most of the time were in Hebrew. So they use the term ger, like in the Mishnah. But they always use ger as a religious proselyte, a convert. Whenever they do write in Greek, they would use proselutos. And they use it always in the religious sense of a convert from paganism to Judaism, from Gentile religion to the Jewish faith.